Okay, so we are about to create our very first Excel macro. And the way that we are going to create this macro is using the macro recorder, which can be located underneath the Developer tab. And within the code section, there is a command called record macro. Now the macro recorder is a very useful VBA tool because it records every task that you perform in Excel. And while it's recording, it writes down and saves everything that we do inside of our VB editor. And then we can execute that task over and over again with just a click of a button. So let's start simple. Let's click inside cell A1. And to start recording our macro, we need to select Record Macro. And we can give our macro a name, a shortcut key on your keyboard, but be careful with this because you don't want to overwrite another Excel shortcut. And we can tell it which workbook to save this macro in. We can just keep it for this workbook, and then give it a description. I'm just going to leave all this blank for now, and click OK. Now up here in our ribbon, we can see that Excel is recording our macro because our button changed to Stop Recording. So now it's recording everything we do inside of Excel. So let's type hello into cell A1 and click Enter. And that's all that we are going to do. So let's stop the recording. Now let's go inside of our VB editor and see what it recorded. If we click Visual Basic, we can see in our project window a new folder has appeared called Modules. And if we click the plus sign to expand this folder, and if we give this module a double click, we can see all the steps that Excel recorded within our code window. I know that this code might look a little foreign to you, but we can try to decipher it as best we can. So within this macro, it says that in the active cell, .formula R1C1 equals hello. And then the next line says range A2 dot select. So basically, for any cell that we select and run this macro, it will insert hello into our active cell and then select cell A2. Let's try it out. For example, if I click in a random cell, let's say H5, and then I come back to our VB editor, click inside the macro, and in order to run this macro, we can click this green play button or F5 on your keyboard, and this will run the macro. So if we click play, our macro inserted hello into our active cell and then selected A2. Well, let's say that we don't want this macro to select A2 after it inserts hello. Well, we can come over here to our code and then delete this line that says range A2 dot select. Now if we click in a different cell in our worksheet, let's say cell E8, and come back over to our code and click play. Now our code has inserted hello, but keeps our active cell selected instead of selecting cell A2. So now let's try to record a little bit more complex macro. In our workbook, let's select the Record Format Sheet tab. And let's say that our daily task was to import this file into Excel, and one of the things that we always do is format our headers. Well, we can just record a macro of how we format our headers, and then we can just run the code every time we import a new file, so we don't have to repeat the format process manually. So let's record another macro. So we need to click on Record Macro. And for this macro name, I'm going to name it Format Headers and click OK. Now Excel is recording every task that we do. So let's say that we want to format our headers with bold text, a dark blue fill color, and then change the color of the text to white. And that's it. So if we come back to the Developer tab and click Stop Recording, and over here in our VB editor, we see our macro name, which is Format Headers, and then everything that it recorded. Now at first glance, reading this code can be very complex, and you might not even know what certain things mean. But if we look closely, we can see that this code selects the range of A1 to J1, which is our header row, and with our selection, it changed the font to bold. And then with the interior of those cells, we changed the color to this accent color. Well, even if you don't know what this code means, you can still run the code and get the results that you're looking for. So if we go back into our workbook and undo those actions, now we are back to plain column headers. Well, we can go to our Format Headers macro and click play. Now our headers have the format that we want. Now there is one thing that I cannot stress enough about running VBA code, is that once you run a macro, there's no undo. For example, we just ran the macro to format these headers. If we look at our undo button at the top of our workbook, it's grayed out. And sometimes your macros can be really complex and make a lot of changes inside your workbook. So if you're worried about messing something up, or your code can be stuck in an infinite loop and cause Excel to crash, what I strongly suggest doing is saving your workbook before you run a macro. So once again, if you run a macro, there is no undo. So that's how you can record macros. And the macro recorder is great, especially if you don't know how to write a piece of code just off memory. You can just use the macro recorder and then try to decipher the code and then pick out the different lines to use in your own code. So even though that the macro recorder is a great tool, unfortunately, the macro recorder limits to what you can actually do inside of VBA. For starters, it's not very versatile, meaning that it always does the same thing no matter what. For example, let's say we imported another file that we wanted to format the column headers for, but let's say that this file only has 4 column headers. Well, if we run this Format Headers macro, it's still going to select the range A1 to J1 and format all those cells, even though that we only want to format columns A through D, not all the way from A through J. And the programming term for this is called hard-coded, meaning that your code will do the same thing every time, regardless. Another con using the macro recorder is that it writes down a lot of unnecessary lines of code that could potentially slow down the speed at which the code can run. And plus, it just makes our code unorganized and harder to read. But once again, the macro recorder is very useful to start out with, and you can start recording macros to automate tasks.